We're recording here. And that's how, okay. So
Yes, right.
Keep your head right there, don't move.
Okay, like that. Yes,
Actually, okay. How's this?
good.
Are you feeling comfortable?
Yeah, very comfortable.
Okay, great. It looks great. And we are ready. Okay. I'll shift into question mode now.
Yes,
now
right.
that I'm leaving
The
setup.
interviewer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, first I would like to just ask you, can you introduce yourself? Your name, where you're currently working, where you're from?
My name is Kwok Pui. I used to teach at the Visible Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Next year, I'm going to be a visiting professor at Canberra School of Theology, Emory University.
Nice. And so what is some of the stuff that you'll be teaching there, or do you have any current research projects you're working on?
I will be teaching 2 courses. The first one is Feminist Theology from the Global South. The second one is Spirituality for the Contemporary World.
Nice.
And I am working on a number of projects. The first project is a book that is called The Practice of Postcolonial Feminist Theology. For a long time, I have been working on postcolonial theory and its interface with the Bible and theology. But lately, I've been thinking more about the practice of it, and that is why I am hoping to finish this book within the next year.
So the practice of postcolonial theology in a liturgical setting or in any setting?
In a church setting or in a Christian mission, and I was asked to go to a BU to do a particular workshop that is called postcolonial preaching. And so I was very interested in how we actually practice preaching and also congregational leadership using a postcolonial lens.
That sounds great. Cool. So I want us to, as you know, you saw the questions, kind of go back to early experiences. So we've been talking to folks about what are some of the early experiences of identity, gender or race or anything that you want to talk about when you first had sort of a consciousness of different identities.
I was born in the British colony of Hong Kong, and my parents went to Hong Kong after the Second World War, and they were traditional parents, and so my parents gave birth to 5 girls before the 2 sons finally arrived. And for anyone from an Asian background will understand perfectly that they have waited for the 2 sons to come to continue the family line. So that is why I knew something about gender discrimination before I even know the word feminism.
So, how did that affect the way that you were, when you first started to realize that, did it shape how you were seeing the world, or were you upset about this, or?
I began to question why the Chinese society in a traditional way was shaped like that. Because obviously my family was not, that is the exception, but rather the norm. That is, even today in mainland China, and you might have heard that there is a one-child policy since the 80s. And if one child means you have a boy, and then the whole family will be very happy. If it, unfortunately, for the parents, happens to be a girl, then people will be quite upset. And even though the policies have been relaxed a little bit, but there is still this hope that you have a son to continue the family line. And so that means if you are born a girl, and then you had that kind of internalized oppression sometimes that you are less than, or you receive less than the sons in the family. So I think that from early childhood, I began to question why girls were treated that way. And that is why when people said that I learned feminism when I came abroad to study, I just laugh. How could it be? Because people did not understand. Each person had a particular story.
Yeah. Is there a particular story that sticks out to you?
Yeah, I think that
being
in terms of providing education or if resources are scarce, obviously the sons will get a better deal. So I think that those kind of deep-seated consciousness became very important for me as later on I work on feminism and theology.
That's good. So I'm pausing a lot after, just so then my voice isn't, but so sorry if that feels a little awkward.
Oh no, it's okay.
It sounds really good, it looks really good, so.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about some of your early experiences of religion or the divine, or what was your life growing up in terms of religion?
My parents, they practiced traditional Chinese folk religion, meaning that we had a family altar at home. And then when the moon waxes and wanes, they will offer food or other things, incense, to the ancestor. So that must be the earliest consciousness that is something beyond this world. Not only that, during New Year, my father would go to a Chinese temple to ask for blessing, just like many Chinese do in Hong Kong and also in Chinese societies. So again, that will be a very important occasion because then he will bring back things from the temple and told us about the experience in the temple. And so that was the earliest experience. But I became a Christian rather accidentally because my parents, both of them, they were not Christians. They both passed away some time ago. And so I became a Christian because a neighbor of ours happens to be a Christian. And he brought my elder sister and me to the Anglican Church. So people used to ask why I became Anglican. Why? Because I do post-colonial things. And I am a member of the Church of England. At least the root can be traced back. So can you see the contradictory positions? Because my neighbor happens to be Anglican. He was the grandchild or a family dated back to one of the first Chinese pastors ordained in Hong Kong. So then I went to Holy Trinity Church. And it is a lovely church because it was built in a Chinese architectural style. And you can Google Holy Trinity Cathedral and you can see the wonderful architecture. And I was fascinated by the architecture because it looks like a Chinese temple. It was not so foreign to me. And inside, it has both Western and Chinese symbolisms. The Western symbolism, you have the Trinity, you have the cross, and then Chinese symbolism, you have the bamboo, and you also have the other clouds surrounding the altar and also in part of the decorations too. So it did not feel that I was in a totally strange environment as I grew up and then was formed by the church.
That's great. How old were you when the neighbor invited you? When did you start going?
It was about 12. And then at first I had a male pastor. But later, surprisingly, I had a woman rector of the church. Her name is Reverend Wang Xianyuan. She became one of the first women ordained in the whole Anglican Communion in 1971 in Hong Kong. But before that, there was the Reverend Li Tem Oi, ordained in the 40s. And so we celebrated both of their ordinations.
Wow, that's really cool. That do this. Was your family supportive you going to the Christian church?
Yes, they were supportive in the sense that they recognized the church provided a lot of education and social services in Hong Kong, being the colonial church, the Anglican church. So even though they practiced Chinese folk religions, they did not object to my sister and myself joining the church. So I was baptized, and then I became very active as a youth leader in the church.
What kind of activities were you all doing?
I sang in the choir, and then later on I became also a very a young youth leader in doing evangelism. I remember still vividly, after so many years, going to some of the villages in Hong Kong, following the elderly women who were very active, the pillars of our church, to do evangelism. We will have that big piece of paper and then teach people how to sing the Chinese hymns, and then we'll tell them the gospel stories. And so that was how I began to be interested in church work. And later, and then it was serendipitous that I became interested in theology. Because at one time, our church had a 3-day seminar on theology led by a professor from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. His name is Dr. Philip Shen. And then Philip came and talked about the grand tradition of Christian theology. I, of course, had not heard about that before. I only heard about very simple things from the sermons and from Sunday schools. But then, when Dr. Shen talked about the tradition that is so broad and comprehensive, I decided as a teenager to pursue theology, and I started when I was 19.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, that was serendipitous that he came to speak to the...
Yes.
How did you then start, when you started theology, did you go to the university or?
Yes, I went to the Chinese University of Hong Kong. There is a Christian college called Chung Chi College. It has a theology division, and so I enrolled as a college student, and then I began studying theology. Imagine you study Karl Barth and Schleiermacher and reading some of their works, obviously translated in English, when you were so young. So later, when I began to do post-colonial studies, I had layers and layers of things to unpack. That is, asking questions, how did I respond to their work then? And how should I be rereading their work? So it is a wonderful journey. I had a very enjoyable ride.
Oh, it sounds like it.
Mm-hmm.
So before we move on to sort of following that thread of your theological journey, I wondered if there's, you talked a lot about sort of your practice of going to the church and some of the practices your parents had. Was there ever, how did you connect with the divine during that time? Was it, or do you have experiences of the divine alongside the practices?
Yes, because in addition to going to an Anglican church, I went to the Christian fellowship in my high school. And it was very important for me because many of them, that is my colleagues then, they came from the evangelical church, not the Anglican church. And then I had the exposure to this evangelical piety, which I thought was very important.
And it was, so that was also part of a formative part
Yes,
of your, okay.
Right. And then we will pray, and then we will have intercessory prayers, and then we will have our retreat. And also in the church, I share some of the experiences and leading Bible studies and doing the things that many of the devout Christians during that time did.
All right. Cool.
I must also tell you that I was exposed to Mary Daly, Naomi Goldenberg, and Rosemary Radford-Ruther's work when I was in Hong Kong. So I did not need to wait until I came to the United States to learn feminist theology, because my ethics Professor Dr. Raymond Whitehead, at that time was pursuing a doctorate from a Union Theological Seminary in New York. So he was the one who introduced to me the work of feminist scholars. Many, many years later, at a conference that Dr. Whitehead and Rosemary Redford Ruther both attended, I told Rosemary it was Dr. Whitehead who introduced your work to me, and we all laughed.
So was that when you were reading Karl Barth and Schleiermacher? You
Yes,
started to read Rosemary and Mary
yes,
Daly?
yes. I also read, of course, Gustavo Gutierrez' A Theology of Liberation. The book was translated into English in 1973, and I still had the book that I bought in the 70s. And so his work was very important, because I have to tell you about the background of my studying theology at that time in Hong Kong. You recall that the late 60s and early 70s was a time of ferment and protest all around the world. Students at Columbia University, at UC Berkeley, they were demonstrating against Vietnam War. And students in Hong Kong, they were demonstrating against the corruption of the colonial government in Hong Kong. And that was the background. And so I saw students, leaders arrested by the police, and there were protests and demonstrations on the street. And then I began to ask the question, what is the vocation of studying theology? What should be the responsibility or the witness of a theologian? And that is why Gustavo Gutierrez's work speaks to me now and also spoke to me then. Because the vocation, obviously, is preferential option for the poor or the marginalized. So many years later, in the year 2000, I met Gustavo Gutierrez, and he signed the book that I bought in the 70s in the same option to Pui Nan. So I cherish that memory.
That's really, really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So every time I teach Gustavo Gutierrez's work, I will show this to my students and share this little story with them. And then I said I would not be pursuing a career in theology without learning from all these wonderful theologians who were really cloud of witnesses around me at that time.
Wow, that's really, really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. Sorry to interrupt with the camera.
Oh, no problem.
Great. So was there, as you were reading some of these theologians like Gutierrez and Rosemary and Mary Daly, what was that experience like reading their work while these protests were going on, and also some of the gender stuff that you had come aware of within your own context?
Yes, I think it is important because the exposure of feminist theology answers a lot of questions for me. That is, number one, I grew up in a rather traditional male-dominated family. And number two, I was asking questions about injustice in society, especially gender injustice. And then I had early on a woman pastor in my church who would later on be ordained as the first, or one of the first, woman priest. So all these questions accumulated in the desire to know more about the Christian tradition and also to look at the theological heritage from new eyes. And I remember there was one book called New Eyes for Reading. It was indeed new eyes for reading not only the Bible, but the whole Christian tradition. So I wrote the first theological paper talking about Tillich and Karl Barth or something like that. And then I said, I really like Tillich better than Barth, because Barth at that time for me was too traditional. Tillich, I began reading the systematic theology. And then I said, wow, you can really reinterpret or recast Christian tradition using new terminologies and frameworks. So I was delighted. And when I read Mary Daly's work and also Naomi Goldenberg's critiquing of gender and religious symbolism, I was also beginning to ask new questions for myself. But my take was different because the 70s was also the time of the Cultural Revolution in China. Because people may remember, at that time, everybody was raising the Mao's Little Red Book, but male and female dressed almost the same in this Mao's outfit, either in blue or in gray. And then women were not supposed to have a perm or to have makeup. And then so you have this so-called gender equality as the ideal. So I grew up in a very different setting, hearing the stories from the Cultural Revolution, both the good things and also, of course, later the bad things as well. So then the question about gender was not set in the same way or understood in the same way as my colleagues who were writing feminist theology in the West or in other parts of Asia. I began to ask, gender is really constructed, isn't it? That is, before, women were supposed to be feminine and look beautiful, but then you have the Cultural Revolution shattered all of those feminine myths. And then afterwards, you know what? When then Mao died and then the down of the Gang of Four, then women began to have perm hair and they want to look feminine again. So it was a really interesting story, and that makes my understanding of feminism multi-layered.
Yeah, that really gave you like real-time lenses on it.
Yes, that is, you began to ask multiple questions from multiple vantage points. So later, when I began to do post-colonial theory, I was prepared for that. That is, you simply cannot answer any question monolithically. You must look at any situation from a hybrid point of view, one of the jargons from Homi Bhabha in his work.
Yeah, that really illustrates it.
Mm-hmm.
So then, could you talk a little bit about how your studies pursued in theology, and eventually when you came to the U.S. and what was sort of that trajectory from when?
Yes, I came to Harvard Divinity School to begin my doctoral study in 1984. And I stayed there until 1988, and I returned to Hong Kong to finish my dissertation and completed my degree in 1989. And those 4 years were very important for me because I have chosen Harvard not only for the divinity school, but because also of its so famous for the study of China. John King, Fairbank, and also a lot of renowned sinologists were teaching at Harvard at the time. And then both of the schools were so close to each other. And so I would go from the divinity school to then go to Harvard Yanqing and to listen to the talks or to participate in some of the seminars. So I really learned from many of those important scholars. Although I was brought up in Hong Kong, but I did not have the opportunity to study Chinese culture and history from a so-called outsider's perspective. And that is what Professor Benjamin Schwartz, Professor Paul Cohen offered me. That is, they have spent their professional career looking at China, not from an insider's point of view, but from an outsider point of view. Outsider means that they, not being Chinese, they may not be bogged down by many things that the a Chinese scholar might care about or might determine his or her research interest. And they also brought a comparative point of view to look at Chinese history and culture. So I learned a lot from them. And I was very fortunate to have a director of my thesis, Professor Gordon Kaufman from the Divinity School, and also Professor Paul A. Cohen, a renowned scholar in Chinese Christianity, as my other advisor. So I was very fortunate. But the most important thing for me during my Harvard years was because I went to Harvard after I have already taught for several years as a junior faculty. So instead of taking those large courses when you just sit there and listen to the lecture, I decided to tailor-make my own doctoral program. So it is more like the European style. So I took a number of courses, but I took many independent studies. I went to study with the scholars that I thought will be very helpful for me, and I also went to a lot of those brown bag lunches. And when you have other scholars or writers who came to visit Harvard, I would then go to listen to them. And that is when I listened to Alice Walker. Alice Walker went to China and then wrote a poem for us. And then it goes like this. The world is full of colorful people, people of color, colorful people, tra-la-la-la. And then when she recited that, I was just so grateful. I was in the audience. So I went up to her afterwards. I said, Alice, I am from Hong Kong. I'm just so glad you had a chance to visit China. And here is my book, In Search of My Mother's Garden. And she signed the autograph with color purple. So that was one incident. Another incident was with Jacques Derrida, the famous deconstructionist. When he came, we had to put him in a big theater because hundreds of people wanted to listen to him. I could not remember what did he say during that occasion so many years afterwards. But I remembered I was fascinated by his work and also his approach because I was introduced to post-structuralist and continental philosophy when I was in the Divinity School. And that is why I had the perfect freedom, or almost perfect, to pursue what I want to study. I was very grateful to the professors at Harvard who believed I could do this. And then they gave me a lot of encouragement. So that is why I really enjoyed my Harvard years. And it was those years that helped me to develop my intellectual curiosity. I did not just study for my doctoral degree. I really studied for the intellectual formation. And that is why after Harvard, I continued my intellectual trajectory and then kept on doing research because I admired those scholars that I have met when I was a student.
Who were, I know you mentioned the two, Gordon Kaufman and Paul Cohen. Mm-hmm. Were there others that influenced you?
Absolutely. And one, of course, was Mary Daly. She just published the book, Pure Lust. And then I went to BU to study with her. You recall that she had that reputation of not taking male students in her class, but would rather teach them in an alternative way. So I went to study with her. And then the class was small, all women, and I was just so grateful to be in her presence because I think that she had this brilliant mind and her passion for women's liberation was deeply influential for me. I also took a class, Gospel Stories of Women, with Professor Elizabeth Schlussler Ferenza. And then I was exposed to her work even in Hong Kong because I wrote a small essay about her work. And so since then, she had been a mentor, a colleague, and later
Hold on.
That is Professor Letty Russell.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, let's take a look. Right. All right. So, yeah, so you can...
So another scholar that was very influential in my own intellectual formation was Professor Letty Russell of Yale Divinity School. I met her in 1983. She was the first feminist theologian from the West that I met. And so she was invited to South Korea to deliver a couple of lectures, and so I went there and in one occasion as her respondent. And so that is how we met. And then I came over in 1984 to begin my doctoral studies, and Letty Russell and Shannon Clarkson invited us to her house and then to form a little fellowship for Asian and Asian American women. 13 of us in her living room started this network that is now called Pacific Asian and North American Asian Women in Theology and Ministry. When we started 32 years ago, we would not have imagined it will continue until the present day. And so then when I became a faculty, and then I served as a faculty advisor. So those who finished, like Rita Nagashima Brock and others, later became faculty advisors to that group. And Letty had been very influential and very helpful in my own professional career. And there's also a cohort of women of color scholars who have been very, very crucial in my own intellectual development. The 80s was a wonderful time to come to the United States to study, because it was also at the time that the voices from women of color became more laudable. Before that, obviously, we might be working on our own, but suddenly then it was a movement. Why? We had that little group of Asian and Asian American women. At that time, we call ourselves Asian Women Theologians. It started the first conference in 1985. And it was also in 1985 that the womanist group began at the American Academy of Religion, because Professor Katie Geneva Cannon graduated from Union in 84, 83, and then the womanists began to publish and to claim that name at that time. Other Maria Isacia Diaz was at Union, and together with other Hispanic, Latina, women theologians and ethicists were also beginning to talk about their theological project. And so it was a wonderful time to get to know Dolores Williams, other Marias, and when we were still in doctoral studies, and our friendship continued.
Wow, quite the cohort.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It's really cool. Okay, so were there ever any, so you've talked a lot about some of these people and mentors,
Mhm.
and the scholarship that you're pursuing, and sort of the intellectual curiosity
Mhm.
that,
Mm-hmm.
were there ever any difficult parts of this experience, this journey?
Yes.
If you could,
There was, yes. I want to mention two. One was passing the German exam. Why it was difficult for me? Because German had a different sentence structure, different from English and also from Chinese. So there was only one time in my life that I failed something, that was German. And so I failed after studying the German tutorial. And then why I failed? Because I could not quite really translate. The exam was translation from one linguistic structure to another. I was too concerned of making it right, so I failed. And then that summer, I went to Europe for a gathering. And then I suddenly found out everyone that I met spoke more than 2 languages, right? German, French, and English, and whatever, Dutch. And then I said, wow, maybe if I look at studying German or French, I need to pass French too, differently, that maybe I would feel it easier to pass the German exam. Then I told this story to my students too. Sometimes it's not that you cannot learn. It's sometimes the psychological hang-up. I needed to pass in order to continue my doctoral studies, so I didn't pass. But I felt that, okay, if I learn something about German or French, next time when I go to Switzerland, I can use French to buy chocolates. That is a different thing, isn't it? So then, finally, not only I passed German, I passed French like this. So that was one story. Another story. There was a very good woman professor at Harvard Divinity School, and I took a class with her. And then, in my final paper, then she used her pen to not only comment on the contents, but also to correct the stylistic and grammatical mistakes. And then she put it on the paper saying that, now I make those editorial comments for you, but it will not affect my judgment of your paper. So then, at first, I was very ashamed of myself. And then, because I made all these mistakes or needing some changes. And then later on, I thought, wow, learning to write is something I need to pay attention to if I want to be a scholar. So instead of internalize that shame that my culture would tell me to, then I took it as a hint that I really need to improve my written English. And since then, believe it or not, I fell in love in learning how to write. I have read many books on how novelists and writers write, and then I became very interested in editing. So I have edited many books, and I enjoyed looking at others' work and give them some feedback how their expression may be improved. So it turns out to be a wonderful experience for me, and I think that unless we learn from our failures, we cannot improve or grow ourselves.
Yeah, how do you, or what do you think led you to that epiphany rather than internalizing the shame from the cultural perspective?
Oh, because I think that I enjoyed the course. I certainly understood the course, and I think the final paper was quite good, okay? And so I was not doubting that I could not do it. But then this was a reminder that I need to be more conscious of improving my writing skills. And so I think that I have the confidence that if I set my mind to do this, that I possibly can. So many years later, I always told my students, writing is a craft. Nobody is just a born good writer. Everybody pays attention to that, and then you can be a better writer. Or if you, that is, devote many hours doing something, that you will improve your skills. And so I hope some of my students will also learn that writing indeed is a craft to be learned and to be mastered.
Yeah, that's good advice.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. So, let's move a little bit into your own writing.
Mm-hmm.
So, you mentioned how in our Mother's Gardens, Alice Walker signed it for you. how did you move from then doing your scholarship and studying to then start publishing? And did you ever have any fears around putting your voice out there, around publishing, or anything like that? How?
I began publishing when I was still in Hong Kong. And there was one piece that I had written, God Weeps with Our Pain, that became something that was anthologized in Asian writings, because I was using Asian women's stories in theologizing. Although it is a short piece, it has that emotional impact. And then after I received a copy, that is this article, God Weeps with Our Pain, was reprinted in a grassroots women's magazine from the Philippines. Then I was very inspired. I thought, wow, theologians' work matters. You are not just writing for the academics. You are writing for women who might find your work helpful. I certainly did not know this Filipino women nor the Women's Network. And my work travels further than myself. And that is why later I had no problem persuading myself that publication of your work mattered and there would be an audience. And I also encourage other women of color to try to devote time and energy to publish more.
That's great.
In my career, I have edited many books, and this gives me not only the satisfaction of discovering something new, but it creates the kind of intellectual networks that I talk about off the menu. Asian and Asian American women talking about theology and religion. So that is a project that came out from PAN-AUTUMN, that is the Network Pacific Asian North American Asian Women in Theology and Ministry. So we collaborated on that particular project. And there is another project called Empire and the Christian Tradition. It's very thick, 29 chapters, I believe. And I co-edited with Don Compier and Jon Rieger. And that was also fascinating too, because we covered from Paul to Mercy Odayoe, from the earliest time to the 20th or 21st century. And each writer would be writing on a particular theologian, talking about the background of the theologian and whether the theologian's work contributed to or challenged empire. And that was also a great effort of learning from each other and creating a discourse on this particular topic that I cared deeply about.
Wow. Did you ever, it sounds like what I'm hearing is that it was, you saw the real benefit in publishing and you were able to get your work out there even as a junior scholar.
Yes.
And, was there ever any difficulty did you ever face any hardships in trying to publish?
Let me just talk about publishing, discovering the Bible in the non-biblical world. And so the book was published in 1995. And I remember I had a hard time finishing it because I wanted to do more research. And then the editor at Orbis, Sue Perry, told me, well, Pui Lan, you should just regard this as a progress report. This is not the final word. And so I was very helped by her advice. And because if I thought that this is my last chance to say something on this topic, I would never deliver the manuscript. But if I just told myself, this is, for the time being, how I thought about discovering the Bible in the non-biblical world, so I was able to deliver the manuscript. Because I think that as a scholar, if we are perfectionists, our work will never be done. So I always tell myself, if this is good for the time being, that's it, okay? If given 3 more years, I possibly can write a book that might be better. But, well, this is the time constraint, and this is the best that I can do, and that's it. So later on, whenever I have deadline, I will tell myself, well, given the time, this is the best that I can do, and I can always revisit my work later.
That's very helpful.
Very good
Yeah.
advice, isn't
Yeah,
it?
I'll take that.
Yes.
No, that's really helpful.
Mhm.
Thank you. Yeah. Hmm.
So there is one aspect that I want to talk about. It is women in academia.
Okay.
And
yeah.
then, of course, later I need to tell you about how I became the president of the American Academy of Religion, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, now.
Yeah,
So let me first talk about working as an academic in America. Well, this is, of course, a challenge because my daughter was only 2.5 when I began my doctoral studies. And then later on, I became a professor teaching theology and spirituality and taking care of family and teaching and then research and contribution to the church and community. Wow, how to balance all those things when you have a little child was a tall order. So, and then, of course, that was also the time that women had to climb up the so-called academic ladder. So it was very tough. And I was fortunate because my spouse was very helpful, very supportive of my work. And then at Episcopal Divinity School, we began in the late 90s a project that is anti-racism and anti-oppression. That means we consciously we trained ourselves, that is the administrators and teachers and the staff, to work on this common project, how to develop students' consciousness about anti-racism and how to develop syllabus that will address multicultural and anti-racist approaches. And I was also very helped when I began interested in post-colonial studies because in 1997, you recall that Hong Kong was returned by the British to China. Then at that time when I began to be interested in post-colonial studies, my colleagues, they were very supportive as well.
That's, yeah, you need that kind of,
That kind of support,
yeah,
isn't it?
to balance all of that.
Yes, because I think that I was lucky because I had Professor Carter Haywood and Christopher Dorai Singh teaching in theology together with me. And Professor Carter Haywood, as you may know that, is one of the leading voices in lesbian theology. And Professor Christopher Dorai Singh was very influential in the development of multicultural understanding of Christianity. And for many years, we call him a theologian among the theologians. So both of them provided very broad parameters for me to work on my own project and to listen to what they were also working on and cared about.
So do you want to talk a little bit about how you became the
Yes.
president? Yeah.
I joined the American Academy of Religion when I was a doctoral student since 1985. And I really benefited from the professional guild, meeting many different people and learning about the frontiers of the field. And then so later, when I was invited to serve on the committee for racial and ethnic scholars in the profession, then I was deeply interested and joined this group. So I became later a chair of that group. And so because I like the work so much and have been involved, and when I was nominated to run for the presidency of the American Academy of Religion, that I was very honored. Not only that, I would be the only second Asian woman to be in line for the presidency. and there were only 7 or 8 people of color as presidents of American Academy of Religion. But I had serious doubts too. Why? Because there would be an election. I would be running against an esteemed colleague. And then I asked, what if I lose? But I was inspired by Hillary Rodham Clinton, because that year that he lost to Senator Obama when they were running for the primary of the Democratic Party. And then you recall that Clinton delivered a very moving concession speech. And she said, even though I lost, but there were 18 million cracks in that glass ceiling. So I said, wow, Clinton can accept the loss with that grace. What did I have to lose? So then when the invitation came, I said, yes. And then, fortunately, I won. And that was a wonderful learning experience, because I got to know more about the Academy and work more with so many wonderful and diverse colleagues. And I learned a great deal during that year. And then I invited some of the best known names and famous people in our guild and outside our guild to deliver plenaries. One, obviously, is one of the most famous Asian cultural critic, Trinh Minh Ha from UC Berkeley. And her colleague, Judith Butler, accepted my invitation to deliver another plenary. It was a wonderful gathering.
Wow, that's excellent.
Mm-hmm.
That's really cool.
Very cool. Isn't this amazing?
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
Extraordinary. And then another occasion was extraordinary. It was at Drew around 2007 when I had an opportunity to talk to Dr. Gayatri Chakravorty Speakwell, one of the leading post-colonial thinkers of our time. And it was wonderful to meet her. She wore a sari, and then when the women faculty of Asian descent invited her to take a picture with us, she graciously took a picture with us and insisted we invite the students, the Asian students, to come to take a picture as well. I remember that so fondly, because this world-renowned scholar took care of the students who admired her and who desperately wanted to have a memory of that picture with her. Mm. And then she insisted that I should not call her Professor Speakwell, that I should just call her Gayatri. And then we had wonderful conversations during that conference, and then the proceedings and additional papers were collected and published as Planetary Love.
Mm. That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Very cool.
Yeah, you've had quite the...
But in post-colonial studies, of course, the big name was Edward Said. I met him once, and I knew that that would be my only occasion of meeting him, because he had cancer. He came to Brandeis to talk about his book, Out of Place, a memoir. And it was raining so heavily, so I took a taxi to go to Brandeis, and it was a marvelous recollection of his life. The book was so honest about his growing up, and he told us he did not believe he would see the book published. Why? Because he had leukemia then. Not only he could see the book published, and then he could even talk about it. And it was a wonderful moment because the book was so helpful to understand his earlier childhood. He grew up not in Palestine where he was born, but in Egypt. But he went to an Anglican church and also because the Anglican school and attended worship services. So later on, when Dr. Ian Douglas and I co-edited the book Beyond Colonial Anglicanism, I sent Professor Said a copy, telling him that I greatly admire your work. And here is one of the first texts using post-colonial lens to talk about Anglicanism, a church that you went to when you were a child. And I hope this is a small token of my gratitude and appreciation of your work.
It's kind of like, full circle back to the
Yes, right.
Anglican Church.
My future, right?
Yeah, so how are we on time?
Oh, well, we almost an hour.
Okay.
I think that I have a lot of stuff there
Yeah, so,
for you. But
Yeah,
do you
no,
want to
there's-
ask other questions?
yeah, so, well, I was just gonna ask you one more quick question about your research.
Okay.
And then we'll move on to the future.
Okay.
Is there, what's your favorite part about doing the work that you've done? And it could be research or it could be teaching or.
Oh, yes. I love teaching because I am a born performer. My daughter said I should be a stand-up comedian. Her friends, when they came to my house, they also said that, oh, your mom is so humorous. But my students and my audience did not see that side of me. Why? When you are invited to go to deliver a lecture, you performed in a very professional way. And then as a Chinese woman, you needed to project an air of authority. So when I attended some of the Asian women's gathering, and then I let my hair down, they were all surprised that I could be so funny. And then, well, life is multifaceted. But anyway, I love teaching. And I was very much helped in my early years by a student because he came to talk to me. He said, Pui Lan, I could not write the final paper. I said, why? He said, I was a ballet dancer. I said, then what? Oh, I used to use my body to express myself and not so much using words. Well, I had two options. I could tell him, well, I don't care, okay? But you have to write your final paper. But I took another route. I took another route, not only helping him to finish his paper, I began asking. In my class, there would be people who used to be a ballet dancer, another person who used to be in business, another one who might be colorblind, and how can I reach them in different ways. So I began during that time experimenting with different modalities of learning, using music, using obviously PowerPoints and other visual aids. And I included ritual and multi-sensory experiences in my teaching. I enjoy being stretched because I was not taught that way. I had to learn a lot how to teach in that way because students, they had different ways of learning and they were not cut in the same cloth. And so I enjoyed talking to my students, helping them grow. And many years after they graduated, sometimes I still maintained contact with some of the students. I like research too. And then research is a very lonely thing, isn't it? You went to the library or read your books and then draft numerous drafts. But sometimes I would be in a different zone when I am writing. Sometimes people ask me, how did I write? Well, I first needed to have an internal dialogue. I listened to so many different voices as a post-colonial intellectuals, multi-layered, multifaceted ways of looking at the world and the text. So I listened very carefully to my internal dialogue, the different voices that surfaced in my head. And then I thought more about it, and then it's as if I was forming the ideas. And when I had more concrete ideas, and then I began crafting. But I did not write every day. I did not have that practice. I had to wait until those voices became coalesced, and then I could articulate a different point of view, or I have a slightly different angle of looking at things. Then I began drafting. And then when I then put my ideas, not on paper, but on the screen, and then I can look at the development of my thought, and then afterwards, obviously, is editing. And the whole process means you are alone doing all this. And so I think being a scholar, you have to bear to be in solitude many, many hours during the day when you are working on a very serious project. But then, when the book came out or an article came out with your name, I rejoiced. I said, see, it's worth it. Now I can offer this as a gift to my readers.
It's beautiful. Thanks. And let's move ahead to the some of the future. So we're going to be looking at hopes and fears, and so what are some of the immediate issues that you think theologians or feminist theologians need to be addressing?
I think when I began my study and also as a scholar of feminist theology, feminism was a progressive term. Today, there were many students who did not like that term in the United States and in other parts of the world. Sometimes you have to defend what feminism means, the so-called F word. Because the younger generation of women, they had grown up and also taken for granted many of the things that people or women in my generation had to thought. And so sometimes they thought feminism is something their mother or grandmother's generations they fought for. Today, we do not need to fight that hard. But I think that the reality is women are still facing gender injustice, not only in the United States, but in many parts of the world. And so this is still a very long project. And talking about feminist theology, when I began my academic training in the mid-80s, we were excited about the project. Today, I think we need to look for new approaches and make new connections. I see the future as so deeply defined by transnational networks and transnational movement. And as feminist theologians, we had to begin to revisit some of the questions that we were asking. And today, we may need to find new questions or the questions of our time, the science of our time, and also begin to develop vocabularies and frameworks to tackle issues that we are facing today.
So what would you, if someone were to show this video in a class of students, maybe considering becoming theologians or religious studies or pursuing maybe a ministry track, what would you tell those students in a classroom today? What advice would you give them?
I think it is important to understand the study of humanities matters. It is not just the STEM, right, the science and the technology. Humanities matters because it is the training of imagination, to use Gayatri Spivak's terminologies, a training of imagination. Unless we can imagine the world differently, we will continue to practice those rules that we are socialized by the status quo. And the status quo is always defined by people who have power. To develop that imagination needs not only humanities, but also a deep understanding of traditions and people's desires and longings. And I see religious studies and theology as trying to learn about what are the most deep-seated values and people's longings and desires. You can call it connections with God or Tillich's ultimate concerns. What are people's ultimate concerns? And why people will be behaving in such a way or making moral judgment in such a way. And those are very profound questions that would have impact for the future of humanity and also the health of our planet. And I see studying theology as tapping into a tradition that looks at ultimate concerns, whether you call it God or divine or the spirit. What motivates people? What people really want to desire? What are the meanings that people have given to their life and passed to their future generations? To be a theologian of our time is a very challenging time. Why? Because we cannot say we are always optimistic all the time. The world has its darker moments. And in politics, we also have depressive leadership as well. But what gives me hope is coming from a civilization that proclaims that we have 5,000 years of history. Now that is a very long framework to look at the present moment. When I started to learn theology, Mary Daly has not published beyond God the Father. Today, so many years later, we have not only white women, we have womanists, we have Asian, we have Latina, we have Native Americans. We have women around the world joining this chorus. And if we ever lose hope, I would just say, look, after decades, we built up an intellectual neighborhood and let that intellectual project continue and flourish. I may not see the future or how it may take its turn, but certainly I hope to be remembered that I contribute a little bit to building that feminist theological project.
Wow.
That's it.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Wow, that was beautiful. Very, very beautiful and inspiring.
Thank you.
Anything else you'd like to say?
No, I think that is
got
very
it all?
good. Yeah.
All right. That was really, yeah, thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for doing this.
No problem.
Just to preserve this for posterity.
Yeah, and it is so inspiring. I mean, we can read your work and a lot of these other folks' work, but it's something else to be able to hear you talk about your stories and what inspires you.
Yes. So would you edit those things and then make it chronological, or you just follow what we said? That is, how did you usually edit?
I'll probably just, so for the, hold that thought. Do you mind if I take a quick picture of sort of the,
okay.
you stay there?
Yes.
And then we like to post it, and then I'll have the equipment.
Okay.
So it'll be sort of a action shot.
Yeah.
And I'll do one from right
Okay.
here. 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, so we'll edit, okay. All right. All right. And then I'll just have you walk towards me and then we'll be done. All right, cut.